Alright, so today we are having another look at Cyberpunk. This time we'll only be testing the RT Overdrive settings. We'll be testing with an RTX 4080 that's paired with a 12700K CPU running at stock, and that again is paired with the DDR4 4000 CL18 memory. Alright, that's the only change to my benchmarking system. It used to be 3600 MHz CL18 and now it's just 4000 MHz or megatransfers per second CL18. So we'll be testing at 1080p, 1440p and 4K, and the aim for these videos for today would be to get a 60 frames per second experience with the lowest possible input latency. Now, as we all know, frame generation does increase the input latency slightly depending on your base frame rate. If you've got a base frame rate of 30 frames per second and you enable frame generation, the input latency is quite horrendous. But if you start with the 50 or 60 frames per second base frames per second and you enable frame generation, then it's actually quite fine. It's a lot less noticeable. Alright, so let's just go over the settings here. At the moment it's on the custom preset. So we've got ray tracing overdrive enabled here. So DLSS, it goes to auto. Right, we'll just disable DLSS, and the rest of the settings are as per the preset. Right, so that's actually how we started this video, and DLSS is definitely enabled here because we were having 40 frames per second. So there's a bug with the Cyberpunk menu where you have to enable and disable DLSS. You can see that it's disabled, so we'll just enable it and disable it again, and now we should be getting like 40 frames per second. Alright, there we go. So obviously at 1080p native with the ray tracing overdrive enabled, we aren't able to hit 60 frames per second with an RTX 4080. I mean, it is a tech demo, it's only used to show off what the technology is capable of, and with decent resolution and decent frame rate, it actually looks quite nice. Now, this car of mine exploded like 4 save games back. I don't know what it's still doing here. I'll try to get rid of it, but it's just yeah, providing warmth for the street beggars. Alright, so 40 frames per second it is at these settings. Let's just enable DLSS quality and see what happens. Alright, so we're just going to enable DLSS quality, no frame generation. The rest of the settings are exactly the same still. Let's just get out of here and let's just reset our numbers. And our frame rate increased by about 20 frames per second, up to 30 frames per second, depending on which area you are. I am playing on Windows 11 with the latest patches, with the latest NVIDIA driver at the time of recording. I've got game mode enabled, I've got resizable bar enabled, and in the gameplay settings, I've got crowd density set to high. But now you can see we are running into a slight CPU bottleneck. Just have a look at the top left-hand corner there. Our GPU temps dropped a little bit, and our GPU usage is sitting below 90%. Some of the time, right? You'd want that to be as close to 100% as you can, so anything above 95% would be ideal. So in this case the CPU is slightly bottlenecking us, but we did get a 60 frames per second experience here. No need for any trickery with frame generation, fake frames, or frame interpolation, however people want to name it these days. I think it's a brilliant technology, but the opinion is still split over that. I think it's got its uses. There's actually quite a lot of people here if the crowd density is set too high. That's quite crazy. I usually play with crowd density set to medium because I like to drive around a lot, and these people just get in my way. I'm just going to enable frame generation and see what kind of frame rate bump we get. So you'll notice that at the moment you enable frame generation, DLSS super resolution goes to auto, and even if you apply it, it goes back to auto again. So we just force quality. Rest of the settings still exactly the same. And now we're getting 120 frames per second, so we almost doubled our frame rate here, which is very, very nice. Now, I'm not sure if you can see that in the top right hand corner there. That's the NVIDIA overlay. Sometimes it shows up in my recordings and sometimes it doesn't. Got no idea why, but the render latency or average PC latency is sitting at around 55 milliseconds at the moment, which is not terrible, and the mouse movement actually feels quite okay. Now, this is a very, very demanding area, especially with the crowd set to its maximum. It's very demanding on the CPU as well as on the GPU. Alright, but we're not here to test a $1,200 GPU at 1080p. Let's move on to 1440p. Right, we're now on 1440p, and just to make sure that I don't cheat, I'm just going to enable the ray tracing overdrive preset again. Let's disable DLSS, I mean, let's just make sure that it is disabled this time. The rest of the settings are exactly the same. So now we don't have DLSS or frame generation. Now there's a difference between these two. Obviously the name says it all, DLSS super resolution. That's just the upscaling, and DLSS frame generation, and more commonly referred to as DLSS 3, which is technically not correct. DLSS super resolution in combination with NVIDIA Reflex in combination with frame generation make up DLSS 3. Alright, so we're at 1440p at native with the RT Overdrive enabled. Let's just reset our numbers here. My hotkey to reset the numbers, Alt and page up, and that then sometimes brings up the gun menu. Quite annoying. Anyway, so at native with RT Overdrive, we're getting 25 frames per second once again. This is definitely not ideal. Motion blur is helping a little bit. I mean, it's masking the low frame rate, but it definitely does not enhance or help the experience. There's definitely a lot of people here. A lot more than I can remember when the crowd density is set to high. Maybe they improved that, because I do know people complained a lot about how empty the city feels. I mean, sure, just put more bodies on the street, right? Alright, that's it for Nathan. I mean, that guy still can't drive, but I think he dodged a pedestrian, and that's why. I mean, I don't blame him. Alright, so let's see what we can do to get 60 frames per second at 1440p with RT Overdrive enabled. So firstly, I'm just going to enable DLSS quality again, no frame generation. I'm pretty sure we shouldn't get 60 frames per second here. It's close, well, very close. 50 frames per second is definitely not terrible. And now we are actually in that base frame rate where it's possible to enable frame generation. Sure, you can enable frame generation if you've got 10 frames per second, but sure, the input latency then is unusable. Go have a look at my RTX 4070 Ti video where I tested this. The latency when we enabled frame generation from 20 frames per second, I think it was like 200 milliseconds, and that just felt unusable. But the gameplay is okay. I mean, sure, the performance hit is extreme, right? But this looks pretty good, and 50 frames per second is not the worst experience, especially if you are playing on a VRR or variable refresh rate monitor, which I'm doing at the moment. But technically, I wouldn't play like this. I prefer my shooters to be a higher frame rate than this. Minimum 60 frames per second, but the higher the better. Alright, let's just enable DLSS balance and see if we can get 60 frames per second then. Alright, we're now on the balance preset. Let's just apply that, reset our numbers, and now we're getting around the same frame rate as what we had at 1080p with DLSS quality. Makes sense because the render resolution is similar. It's not the same, but it's similar. Slightly higher at 1440p balanced, but we are almost getting a locked 60 frames per second experience here. Now, CDPR did a lot of good things with this game. Eventually, it only took them a year or 3, but the game is definitely a lot better than it was at launch. Just have a look at the frame time graph there. Very, very few stutters. The 1% and the 0.1% lows can attest to that. Sure, there is a spike every now and again. That's just the auto-save. So if you do see a big spike, that's probably it. Alright, now we got 60 frames per second. I'm just going to drop down to DLSS quality again and then enable frame generation, see what happens. Right, so we're on the quality preset. Well, it doesn't really matter because it keeps on changing. Alright, so now we just enabled frame generation, DLSS quality. Remember, we had around 50 frames per second previously. Let's reset our numbers, and getting around 80 frames per second plus. And the mouse movement, I can feel a slight delay in the input latency. Definitely nothing terrible. I wouldn't find it desirable to play a competitive online first-person shooter like this, but the input latency for a single-player game is definitely still acceptable. I mean, it feels pretty responsive. It just feels like we are playing maybe at 45, 50 frames per second, what the base frames per second basically was before we enabled frame generation. So I don't really feel that big an increase by enabling frame generation. Alright, now let's just move down to DLSS balance to see if we can improve the input latency a little bit. Now I know you have to go by what I tell you. I do play a lot of first-person shooters. It's actually my favorite genre. So I'm pretty sensitive to input latency. So I do think my opinion does count for at least something. Right, we're just going to enable DLSS balanced here. Let's see if we can get over 100 frames per second here, and 105 it is. Let's just reset the numbers. Now, once again, this is a very demanding area. In other areas, we should be getting higher frame rates than this, especially just, well, to the north of here, where the roads are a little bit more empty. But this is a pretty good experience in the game. Still looks plenty good. I personally wouldn't go below DLSS balanced at 1440p. The render, or the internal rendered resolution, just becomes too low to my personal taste. Alright, so that was it at 1440p. This is actually very, very playable. I'd probably play it at this setting because I do enjoy a higher frame rate, but you can play on the DLSS quality preset as well, as it gave us around 80 to 90 frames per second as well. Alright, now it's time for 4K. Right, we're now at 4K. I'm going to enable just the preset once again and then just disable DLSS. Let's just make sure that it is disabled. I know it's annoying. Alright, I don't think this is going to go well. I mean, the demo footage for this game, that's terrible. The 4090 was getting 16 frames per second, and here we are getting 12. I mean, that's close enough to 16, right? I don't care how good the game looks, this is a terrible, terrible experience. But once again, it is a tech demo. A lot of people hammer on the performance of path tracing in this game. Once again, it's literally just to show you what the technology is capable of. It's not really meant to be like, this is how the game should be played. It's just nice to look at, right? Just to see what the future might hold. And maybe if it does become a little bit more mainstream, there would be performance improvement. Because this is terrible. All right, I'm just going to go down to DLSS quality here. I think we will probably have to go down to performance, ultra performance in this case. That's the wrong menu. Right, let's just put it on quality for now. We might get 20 frames per second, I think. 25 frames per second, which we had at 1440p native, more or less. So the MSI Afterburner overlay in the top left-hand corner is a bit small. I'll just magnify it in edit, so it might look a little bit weird in the top left-hand corner. It's just at 4K. I mean, that overlay scales with resolution. And I don't want to go back into Windows to change the scale because sometimes the game crashes when you Alt-Tab. Alright, definitely not a playable experience even with DLSS quality. Let's move down to balanced. Alright, so balanced netted as another 7 frames per second, basically. Definitely not great. I mean, we are far from hitting a VRAM limit. You can see we are using around 10.5 gigabytes of VRAM, and this is a 16 gigabyte GPU, obviously. So 30 frames per second. Now, if we have to enable frame generation, the input latency will just be terrible. But I just want to see what DLSS setting we need to use to get close to 60, and then we'll start playing with frame generation. Right, we're now on performance. I don't think we'll be hitting 60 frames per second just by playing around with the DLSS super resolution settings. Now, this still looks okay at 4K DLSS performance. Ultra performance, it does become a little bit softer, a lot more noticeable anyway, but we aren't even close to that 60 frames per second. We gained another 7 to 10 frames per second, because we're now in the 40s, more or less. Alright, this is not going to cut it. Let's try ultra performance. Alright, this is actually pretty good. Ultra performance, we are getting 60 frames per second without frame generation. Ultra performance is now, well, I actually ran around so much that I leveled up. So ultra performance is actually upscaling from 720p. You can see the artifacting in the lighting there. It looks terrible. It's just flickering. I'll just put up a seizure warning before this. But at the moment you get closer, it does look a bit better. There's still a lot of shimmering in the garage door here, and 720p upscale to 4K, definitely not worth it in my opinion. Sure, some games might look a bit better, but first-person shooter, as much detail as Cyberpunk, I just think you lose quite a lot by upscaling from 720p. Alright, so I'm going to go down to DLSS balanced again, because that's where it looked pretty okay, and then we'll test our frame generation. Actually, let's go to DLSS quality and enable frame generation. Remember, we had a base frame rate of 25 frames per second, and now we've got a frame rate of 43, so it almost doubled. But the input latency at the beginning was a lot worse than now, but this is still not ideal. I mean, especially for a first-person shooter. If you've got a third-person RPG that you play with a controller, this would still be okay. You don't really need responsive input latency for those type of games, especially if you use a controller. But for a first-person shooter, the latency here is definitely terrible. It's noticeable, it's terrible, and landing headshots would be pretty difficult. Alright, so that's not going to cut it. Let's just drop down to balanced again. Alright, we're now at DLSS balanced, and we are running at 50 frames per second. Remember, we were running at around 30 frames per second without frame generation with these settings. And the input latency, if there was a decrease, it's not that noticeable. I mean, going from 25 to 30 frames per second, only 5 frames per second. Percentage-wise, it's quite a lot, actually. It's like 20%, but the input latency at these settings definitely still noticeable. Alright, we're still not getting 60 frames per second, even on DLSS balanced, so let's drop down to performance. Alright, we're now on DLSS performance, and now we are getting around 60 frames per second. Alright, so this is okay. I mean, I'd be able to play at 4K with DLSS performance. It doesn't look terrible. Let's just have a look at the lights here. A lot of people, once again. The lighting, you have to be quite a lot further away for the lighting to actually start breaking than at ultra performance, but it's still not ideal. I mean, I think we were standing around about here and the lights broke on ultra performance. The input latency is acceptable now. I don't think it'll be perfect, because obviously we are now coming from, what was it, around 40 frames per second. So it just holds true that if you have around 50 to 60 frames per second and you enable frame generation, it should be fine. Anything lower than that, the input latency is a lot more noticeable. Alright, but at least we got 60 frames per second. Technically, I wouldn't play the game like this. The input latency makes the game feel a lot less smooth than it actually is. So let's go down to ultra performance and see what's the highest frame rate we can actually get at 4K. Alright, we're now on ultra performance, and remember, we had 60 frames per second previously without frame generation. Now we're getting around 100 frames per second. The game feels a lot better. The input latency is a lot more reduced. It's definitely much better. But yeah, you can see standing on this crossing here, the flickering lights are just terrible. And if we stand here with the it actually looks a bit better than further. No, it doesn't. Alright, so the lighting is definitely a lot more flickery, if that's even a word, at ultra performance. I mean, it makes sense. Once again, it's upscaling from 720p, but we are getting around 90 frames per second. So not ideal. I mean, quality-wise, the game doesn't look good at all, and I think that just negates the whole path tracing update, because the whole idea of path tracing is to make the lighting a lot more accurate and a lot more realistic. And then if you have to go and lower your visual settings this much just to get a playable frame rate, I just think it negates it completely. Alright, but I personally wouldn't play like this, even if the frame rate is around 100 frames per second. The input latency is okay, as I said, but the game just doesn't look good at all. Right, so just to give you an idea, I'm going to disable path tracing completely. We're getting if we look at this direction at 96 frames per second, I'm just going to disable path tracing. Let's see what normal ray tracing performance is like. All the settings are going to be exactly the same. I'm just going to disable path tracing here. Now you can apply it and then you get additional ray tracing options. All right, so let's just leave everything on and ray trace lighting on ultra. Remember, 95 frames per second, give or take, and now we're getting 130 frames per second. So a nice 30 to 40 frames per second. But I mean, well, it actually does drop quite a lot. But you can see we are CPU bound in some scenarios, and that's the AI. The crowd actually takes up a lot of CPU cycles, and that's why I personally play with medium crowd settings, because it just alleviates some load off the CPU. Alright, so that's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.